Chapter 5. The Prince of Berk. The first thing Bunny did when Jack got back was throw Jack's feathered hat in his face. The second thing he did was pull the hat off again to glare at him. The third was dropping Jack's clean bard uniform in his arms, and the last shoving the hat back on Jack's face, more firmly this second time. Your voice is heaps more tolerable like this. Jack shook the hat off, spitting out a feather. I take it Tooth told you what happened? Only up to the part which he found you hounded by a pack of royal guards in the middle of the city, dangling a Prince of Berk over the rooftops like a stuffed animal. The Prince of Berk. It's just him. Oh, even better. Bunny threw Jack's travel bag onto his arms, too. We're leaving. Jack did a take. What? But we just got here. And now we'll just go. Bunny whirled around the room, tossing their belongings into 2 more travel bags on the bed in the center of the room. The way Tooth's colorful clothes and Sandy's puppets flew into the bags made it look like they were sitting inside a rainbow reverse fountain, the sound of water replaced by Bunny's cursing. Come on, pack your things. Tooth and Sandy are out front checking us out of the inn. And put on your uniform, including the hat. They're probably already hanging up wanted posters looking for a large-eared, brown-haired, stringy-limbed boy who looks like someone was building a gremlin but changed their mind 3 minutes before finishing. Come on, Bunny, they never got a good look at me up close. Plus, I can't be the only brown-haired gremlin boy in the city. We're the weeds of boy kind. You're overreacting. And you're acting as if you weren't just walking around like a kicked dog in the rain, counting down the days till we left from the moment you got here. So why are you complaining now? Actually, I was going to ask if we could stay a bit longer than usual. How much longer? 2 weeks? 2 weeks? Well, technically I only need another week and a half on top of our usual stay time, but I figure we might as well round up for safety. So you want to stay for 2.5 weeks? Oh, well, might as well round up to 3. Jack held his hands up before Bunny could retort. Besides, you guys haven't stayed in one place for more than a few days ever since I joined. It's going to be a nice change of pace for you, too. We never stayed longer because you'd never let us. Why the sudden change of heart? There was a pause. I think I found something. Bunny froze, the shirt that he was about to throw still half raised. He turned to look at Jack. Have you? I think so. It could just be your standard excitement, but I have this weird feeling like... Jack looked down, furrowing his brows. He shook his head. I don't know, I just feel lighter. Bunny was studying him when Jack looked up again, a pensive look on his face. Does it have something to do with this Prince? Hiccup. His name's Hiccup. Jack nodded. He's the guy who threw me that shield the other day. Bunny's eyebrows rose up. He brought a hand to his chin. Hiccup, huh? That's oddly endearing for a Berkian name. What about him is making you want to stay? I said I'd help him with the project he's working on. A project? A glider. He's building a glider, Jack said while running a hand through his hair. The idea was still so incredible to him that words came out breathy. He felt himself break out into a smile. Bunny, he's trying to fly. Bunny stared at him a beat longer. The last of his frustration seemed to fade away. Then he huffed. Okay. Jack did a take. Okay? Am I hearing that right? Just like that? Just like that, Bunny smirked. He turned to the travel bags and started unpacking again. Go tell Tooth and Sandy we're going to be here for another 3 weeks. Hopefully they haven't given back the keys to the room yet. What about the guards you were just talking about? Oh, don't think I've forgotten about that. You're washing the carriage for the next month. We'll have to play things carefully, but seems like this might be worth risking it. Jack realized his mouth was hanging open and snapped it shut before Bunny could see. Why are you suddenly okay with this? Bunny put his hands on his hips, huffing a sigh. I said I'd help you search for whatever it was you needed to find. He met Jack's eyes, and Jack saw a new light in them. From the looks of it, you just did. Gratitude fluttered through Jack. He felt himself smile again. I wasn't sure if I would. Bunny's smile turned warm. I never doubted it. He pointed a finger at Jack. You will wear your uniform out in public, though. I'm not looking to come to blows with Berkians the size of buildings anytime soon, let alone the armored ones. Can't guarantee I can break you out of the dungeons if you're caught. Jack laughed. He picked up his hat with a new, albeit begrudging, appreciation for it, putting it on with mock flourish. Hopefully by then, Hiccup and I will be soaring high over their heads. Hiccup lost count of how many times he fell down that day. He had given up on keeping track after his and Jack's impromptu market escapade. But whatever the number was, it was doubling within the hour. "Hiccup, what's going on?" Astrid walked up to where he was lying after kicking him several feet out of the sparring ring. Again. Hiccup grunted, spitting out dirt. He stuck the tip of his sword into the ground, using it to push himself up into a sitting position.
"What do you mean? You always win these."
"Yeah, but not by this wide of a margin. That's your 4th loss in a row, and you set a new record for distance being kicked." Hiccup deadpanned.
"Glad you've been keeping track. I was just about to start measuring."
Astrid smirked. She stabbed her sword into the ground, putting her hands on her hips. "Something's up with you." Hiccup set his sword aside and leaned his arms on his knees. He picked up his circlet crown from the ground, absently wiping dirt off the small ruby at the center.
"Nothing's up. It's just the usual routine with my dad."
"You brought up peace negotiations again, didn't you?"
"Maybe the 57th time will be the charm,"
Hiccup grumbled. Astrid huffed, shaking her head. By now she had learned it was useless to argue with him after he'd set his mind on something he believed in. It only took about 10 years of being out-stubborned by Hiccup to learn it. To her credit, she held out longer than most people. The one exception was currently still gripping the record by the throat after 20. However, this was a special case for them, and everyone else in the kingdom. "He's probably even more wound up with how many soldiers we keep losing." Astrid sighed. "The only reason he hasn't closed the borders yet is because he doesn't want to cut off the smaller villages. But given how heavy our losses are and how little intel we have, he's starting to suspect we might already have spies within the city." That was also why, among other things, Hiccup wasn't telling Astrid about Jack. His heart still sank.
"Did any scouts make it back this time?"
Astrid shook her head. "We can't recover their bodies either. The messenger hawks they sent were all shot down too. All we know is, whoever's invading us, they're getting closer."
"How close?"
"We lost contact with the last group around the edge of our side of the murderous mountains. That's only a few miles from the outer villages." Hiccup ran a hand down his face.
"I'm running out of time to get through to him."
"Hiccup, is this just about proving something to your father?" Hiccup gave her a look.
"No."
Then he sighed, looking away.
"Well, not anymore, anyway. This is bigger than all of us. If we could just find a way to get both sides to talk."
He looked down at the crown in his hands. He thought back to around the 43rd time he tried to convince his dad to enter negotiations with the outsiders. Maybe he would have actually considered it for a split second if Hiccup's invention for the messaging system had worked. Then again, the 7 shattered stained glass windows, 3 broken crossbows, and 1 very unlucky guard who was hit in the face by the scroll probably set him back by a few attempts at convincing. It seemed like they would have to keep hoping that one of the messenger hawks made it back for the time being.
"If we can even learn who they are."
"Actually, we just might." Astrid gave him a smile. "The king's sending the knights to captain the next scouts." Hiccup felt himself smile at that, new excitement lifting him up. Ever since he was a child, the knights inspired him, both the ones in the storybooks and the ones living and fighting for Berk today. He remembered his dad holding a tiny Hiccup up so that he could see over the castle balcony. Up above the cheering crowds that lined the streets, they would watch the parade of knights return home after battle, riding on their tall horses, waving the Berkian flag up high in the air, and carrying the royal crest proudly on their shields. Maybe he wouldn't be in this alone after all. Under the knights' leadership, the troops might make it back this time, and he could finally find a way to speak to whoever was coming.
"Who's he sending?"
"Dames Agatha and Egengard, and Sirs Flashburn and Spiteloud, all going to oversee the next company."
"Spiteloud too?"
Hiccup grinned, holding back a snort for Astrid's sake.
"Does that mean—"
Astrid's next sigh was long and weary.
"Yeah, the whole gang's here. Between that and guarding the border, the knights are spread thin enough where even he had to dump his pride and joy on me."
She sheathed her sword with a frustrated grunt, joining Hiccup and taking a seat on the ground. "I'm never taken on a squire," she muttered. Hiccup gave her a sympathetic smile.
"How are the squires doing?"
Astrid huffed, blowing her fringe out of her face. "Well, Snotlout's at the top of the class now, but that's not saying much given his competition.
He'd improve a lot faster if he stopped getting distracted checking himself out in the reflection of his shield, or his reflection in an oncoming sword.
Hiccup snorted, then put his hands up in surrender when Astrid shot him a glare before continuing.
Fishlegs is still too scared to hurt anyone. He's big enough to man a whole battering ram alone, but I only just convinced him to upgrade from a dagger to a short sword.
How long did that take?
Faster than it took to get him to a dagger from a butter knife.
That's not saying much considering he was still scared of the butter knife.
Astrid punched his arm, and Hiccup tried not to wince.
And the twins?
Are a headache.
Astrid groaned and rubbed her temples.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Hiccup chuckled.
On the bright side, it's been 3 whole days since they last tried to...
Damn Astrid!
The two of them looked up to see Fishlegs hurrying towards them across the sparring field. He was wearing the standard squire uniform. Like all the others, Astrid's traditional Hofferson family coat of arms was hastily sewn over his master knight's as a sign of temporary change in command. Fishlegs spotted Hiccup and stumbled to a halt, nearly falling over from trying to bow and run at the same time.
Oh, pardon me, Prince Hiccup. I didn't know you'd be here, too.
Just Hiccup is fine, Fishlegs.
Right, sorry, Prince.
What is it, Fishlegs? Astrid interrupted.
The twins are doing it again.
Astrid threw back her head and let out a loud groan.
Restart the count.
At least that's a new record,
said Hiccup, putting his crown back on. He and Astrid leapt to their feet and followed Fishlegs to the royal arena. Then Hiccup and Fishlegs followed Astrid as she barreled past them. They found Snotlout at the front of the stands, leaning over the railing and egging the contenders on.
"Snotlout,"
Hiccup called.
"Have they started yet?"
Snotlout looked over his shoulder.
Well, looky here, if it isn't your royal high, nerd.
Oh, Astrid, you made it. Great. I tried to stop them, since I'm second in command after you, of course, but even my rippling muscles, chiseled physique, and natural charisma wasn't enough to hold them back on their horse. Astrid pushed him out of the way and took a spot at the railing.
"Roughnut, Toughnut, how many times have I told you Mountainites to stop jousting each other?"
I don't know, Astrid, replied Roughnut's voice from below. How many times have we ignored you when you did? I know how we can tell, Toughnut's voice joined in. We can count all my manly jousting scars.
Ew, gross, put your shirt back on.
Hiccup joined Astrid at the railing, taking in the scene. The twins sat on their horses across from each other in the middle of the giant arena, both armed with a lance. They had taken down the barrier between either side of the track, leaving nothing to keep them safely on course. They were a solid 15 or more feet below them, with nothing but a flat drop in between. The raised stands were newly constructed after one too many spectators had accidentally been impaled during matches, or any event held there, really. Unfortunately, that meant that it was harder for people to run in and break up the brawls that followed afterwards. It was also the only thing keeping Astrid from pulling the twins off their horses and throttling them by their necks. That might have been for the best, considering how tight she was gripping the railing. Hiccup thought he might have heard the wood crack. She looked like she was physically holding herself back from taking the jump, broken bones be damned. Even more impressive was how she held back the stream of curses, judging by how red her face was turning. Especially since the courtesy section of the Code of Chivalry was more of a friendly suggestion than a rule in Berk. She probably didn't want to break her 2-day streak. Hiccup was almost tempted to jump down there himself and save them before Astrid snapped. Almost.
"Get back up here before I line you up and run the lance through both of you myself,"
Astrid ordered. The twins flipped up the visors on their helmets, which just so happened to be the only pieces of armor they were wearing. They weren't even carrying shields. "Hey, Hiccup," Roughnut smirked when she saw him, wiggling her fingers. "You're just in time to judge our match with your royal opinion."
"I'm judging this as a terrible idea, Roughnut, and that you should stop before one of you gets skewered."
He glanced at Astrid.
"And the other one mauled to death after that."
"Sorry, Hiccup," Toughnut cut in, holding his fist over his heart. "Some things are even more important than the orders of a prince. This is a matter of honor." "No," Roughnut rolled her eyes. "This is because I called your haircut dumb and laughed when you cried about it. Honor, I say."
"At least put on some armor,"
Hiccup pleaded.
"Pfft,
armor," the twins cackled. They flipped their visors back down and raised their lances. "On the count of 3, Toughnut yelled. 1.
Go, Barf!"
Roughnut spurred her horse forward.
"Oh, come on. Forward, Belch.
Tufnut followed suit.
For honor!
Hiccup turned to Astrid.
Those aren't the practice lances, are they?
Nope. Astrid drew her sword and unhooked the scabbard from her belt, handing the latter to Hiccup. With what was pure reflex to them at this point, in 2 swift movements, they hurled them at the twins. Hiccup threw the scabbard so that it clipped Roughnut's hand, making her drop her lance. Meanwhile, Astrid's sword pierced through Tufnut's lance and ripped it out of his grip. Without any weapons, shields, or a barrier between them, the twins screamed and desperately pulled back at their horses' reins. They swerved the horses away before they could collide, but the sharp turn sent them both flying off their saddles. Still holding their reins, they crashed in the air and fell on top of each other into the mud. They sat up and yanked off their mud-filled helmets, spitting more out of their mouths. They went to wipe the mud off their faces and tongues, only to find their reins tangled together.
Get your horse's reins out of my horse's reins. No, you get your horse's reins out of my horse's reins. Your face is a horse's rein. Your face is a horse's butt. Barf brain? Fart head?
The twins stopped trying to untie their reins in favor of fist fighting in the middle of the field. Then they went from fist fighting to wrestling, and then from wrestling to pulling hair and biting.
Should we help untangle them?
Hiccup asked Astrid again.
Nah, leave 'em. They deserve it, plus it'll stop them from doing it again.
Roughnut got a good chomp on Tufnut, whose yowl spooked Barf and Belch. Tufnut flailed so wildly that he managed to launch mud all the way up into the stands. Hiccup dodged to the side, leaving the large glob flying at them to splash directly into Astrid's face.
All right, that's it,
Astrid snarled. She stomped down the stairs to save them from getting trampled by the horses, probably so she could do it herself. The twins froze in place, Tufnut's arm still clamped between Roughnut's teeth. This was as good an opportunity as any to duck out. Hiccup stretched and gave an exaggerated yawn.
Okay, well, you clearly have your hands full with these guys. I'll just get out of your way and leave you to it. See you later, goodbye.
Astrid narrowed her eyes at him.
Where do you think you're going? I'm turning in early.
Hiccup yawned again for emphasis.
Long day today, busy day tomorrow. You know how it is.
Astrid deadpanned.
Hiccup, I already had to cover for you once today, and twice the day before. I'm running out of excuses to tell the king.
Hiccup sighed, dropping the act. He met Astrid's gaze.
I know, but this time it's really important. One last thing and then I'm done, I swear.
He coughed into his fist.
At least for today.
Astrid scowled, her eyes seething with rage. She stormed over to where Tufnut's lance landed, ripping out her sword and pointing it at Hiccup.
You're not leaving until you beat me in a spar. In fact, none of you are.
She whipped around to glare at the twins.
Especially you two.
The twins flinched in unison.
Yeah,
cheered Snotloud, looking excited for a second chance to see bloodshed.
Fight, 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 fight.
He punched Fishleg's arm, getting him to join in on his chant. Behind Astrid, the twins stared at Hiccup and clasped their hands together in a silent plea for their lives. Hiccup glared at his friend group of 5 idiots, making a mental note to glare at the 6th idiot in the mirror later, genuinely debating abandoning the others to Astrid's wrath. He was closest with Astrid, of course. Coming from a long line of knights, she had been the youngest squire to be knighted at Berk in history at just 17 years old. Before that, she had been the youngest page to be promoted to squire at 10 and, thus, was saddled with being 10-year-old Hiccup's training partner. And when she wasn't doing that, she was saddled with protecting him from death by falling on a sword or death by falling in general. In theory, he couldn't be faulted for having wavering loyalties to the others. But he had, unfortunately, come to care for all of them over the years of forced proximity after the rest were promoted to squires as teenagers. Leaving them at her definitely not mercy now would weigh an annoyingly heavy amount on his conscience. Another part of him was grateful to have a group of friends his age at all who treated him as an equal, or a bit less than in Snotloud's case, instead of a talking fishbone with a crown you were forced to respect. And, in terms of pure practicality, the other 4 wouldn't provide much of a buffer before Astrid finished them all off and came after him too. He groaned and made his way down to the field. Fishlegs and Snotloud cheered and pumped their fists in the air while the twins bolted away from Astrid. They whispered their thanks to Hiccup as they passed him on the stairs, crawling up on all 4s.
Thanks for the safe, your highness. We owe you one. You are a truly wise and noble ruler, O mighty Hiccup, horrendous Haddock the...
Yeah,
Hiccup muttered.
Just be ready to run in case I lose.
He picked out his go-to hand-and-a-half-length sword from the armory on the side of the arena, grabbing a shield for both him and Astrid before joining her on the field. He twirled the sword a few times to get a sense for its weight, then settled into his stance. Astrid mirrored him. There was a new spark in her eyes, allowing a small curl of her lips to make it past the scowl.
You better take it seriously this time.
Hiccup felt himself grin too, in spite of himself.
Don't I always?
Astrid rolled her eyes. Then she dropped her smile and stepped to the side. Hiccup dropped his as well, following her lead, the two of them circling each other. Astrid finished sizing him up first and attacked, opening with a lunge of her sword. Hiccup deflected it off his shield, swinging his sword at the opening. Astrid swung her shield in a wide arc and knocked the blade aside, bringing down her sword like an axe over his head. Hiccup recovered and brought his sword into a high guard, meeting hers halfway, the sharp sound of clashing metal ringing through the air. They clashed, disengaged, then clashed again, the two of them testing each other's defenses, circling each other all the while. The squires heckled them from the stands. For a captive audience, they were annoyingly demanding. When he circled to face them, he noticed that even though Roughnut and Toughnut were squeezing their eyes shut and crossing all their fingers on both hands, they still had one eye cracked open a fraction, and were actively booing with the rest of the squires. Hiccup wanted to roll his eyes.
Fine, might as well give them a good show.
He stopped walking and stood up straight. Astrid followed suit, her brows angling to scowl in confusion. Hiccup raised a brow at her, tossing his shield to the side. With extra flourish, he pulled the cloak he was wearing off his shoulders, waving it in a wide arc like a flag before stepping forward into his ready position again. He held his sword forward on guard and held the cape behind him in defense. He nodded towards the armory in a silent offer. Astrid paused, an amused smirk replacing the scowl. She tossed her shield aside as well and unsheathed her dagger from her belt. She made a show of twirling it in her hand before settling back into her ready stance. Hiccup grinned. Now things were getting interesting. Taking the first move, Hiccup stepped forward off his back foot, fanning his cloak in a wide arc towards Astrid's feet, making her back up. Without warning, he pulled up and cracked it like a whip. Astrid leaned back, and Hiccup took advantage of the distraction to twist the cloak over her outstretched sword, planning to disarm her of her dagger while her main weapon was trapped. What he didn't anticipate was Astrid lunging forward, driving her sword into the cloak at him. He yelped and pulled the cloak back, rushing to block her thrust, and fell for a feint, his sword meeting her dagger instead, his blade slotting in the corner of the crossguard. Without missing a beat, Astrid flipped her grip on the dagger so it faced downward and drove it up the blade at Hiccup's hand. Hiccup dropped his arm and leapt back, snapping his cloak in front of him to cover his retreat. They smiled at each other from the few feet apart, giving playful battle cries as they rushed each other again, the squires in the stands cheering them on. Astrid played on full offense, now having the option of rapid close-range attacks with her dagger, making it twice as dangerous to approach her. Hiccup fought on the defense, strategically controlling their positions in the fight by creating barriers with his cloak, using it as a whip to force them to disengage and concealing his attacks behind it to keep her guessing. However, as the fight went on, Astrid began to read his moves. It was only a matter of time before she cut past his defenses and got up close. He would have to take the initiative before she could finish analyzing his attack pattern. Hiccup waved his clothes in a wide fan between them, spinning it in a large circle, blocking Astrid's view of him. Taking a risk, he let go of the cloak and gripped his sword in both hands for more strength behind his attack. He lunged forward out from under in a surprise attack, catching the cloak on his shoulder. Astrid jumped back, but parried his barrage of strikes aside. Settling on having created some distance, Hiccup threw the cloak up and moved back to retreat. The downside to blocking your opponent's view, however, was that it also blocked some of your own. Hiccup was reminded of that when he jumped back from a sidekick she threw at him from her side of the cloak, just in time to dodge her sword that she stabbed straight through the cloth. Hiccup winced. That was his last cloak.
Maybe I can still tailor it.
In an impressive display of blade alignment, Astrid slashed her sword upwards, cutting right through the cloth.
Oh, good. More evidence that fate hates me.
Astrid charged him, alternating between wide sweeping slashes and stabs from her sword with sporadic close-range lunges with her dagger to catch him off guard. Hiccup stayed quick on his feet, gripping his sword in one hand again for faster transitions between guards to counter her versatility, focusing on keeping up while waiting for an opening. His opening came when Astrid overshot, barely pulling her sword back over her head in time to dodge Hiccup's slash at her hand. With her main weapon out of the way, Hiccup brought down the butt of his sword and knocked the dagger out of her hand. The move left his back wide open. Astrid swung her sword down on Hiccup's head. Hiccup managed to grip the hilt of his sword with both hands and put up a high block. Their blades clashed one last time, locked in a bind. The split second of battle stretching endlessly, and the two pressed forward, neither gaining leverage over the other, both of them grinning wildly at each other. Hiccup smiled when he felt the telltale clink of Astrid's blade hitting the corner of his crossguard. With one last flourish, he swung their swords together in a wide circle, grappling Astrid's sword out of her hands, the momentum knocking her off balance. Right as Astrid straightened, Hiccup pointed the tip of his sword at her throat. They stood there, grinning at each other, Astrid having calmed from blowing off some much-needed steam, while Hiccup's spirit had been lifted from the adrenaline rush. The squires cheered in the stands, Roughnut and Toughnut setting aside their squabble and hugging each other while jumping up and down. Fishlegs whooped and pumped his fist in the air. Even Snotlot clapped reluctantly, rolling his eyes. Hiccup dropped his arm holding the sword, hunching over and putting a hand on his hip. Both he and Astrid were panting hard from the workout.
Thank you,
Hiccup said half-heartedly, waving at his audience.
I'll be here forever.
That's a lie, and you know it, Astrid said. She pointed her sword at the twins. 2 weeks of stable cleaning duty for both of you, and don't even think about untying those reins on Barf and Belch, or I'm tying you two on their saddles next.
Yes, ma'am,
the twins shouted in unison, saluting her. They gave Hiccup a thumbs up when she turned back around. Hiccup sent him an exasperated glare.
Go on, then,
Astrid said to him, sheathing her sword. Get back before the king comes asking again.
The faster you are, the less embarrassing whatever I tell him you're doing will be.
Hiccup gave her a smile.
Thanks, Astrid.
He paused.
Actually, one more thing. Do you happen to have an extra squire uniform that I can borrow?
While Berkian squires didn't wear nearly the amount of heavy armor that the knights did, they still had a sturdy amount of protective gear, in between the leather wrist bracers, shoulder pads, and boots. The thick belt was secured over a heavy cotton tunic with multiple loops to hook their swords and any supplies that a squire might need for the night. This was a uniform from Astrid's own family, so the Hofferson coat of arms on his chest was embroidered into the fabric. Hiccup had also taken one of the helmets from the twins in place of a hood, and had done his best to wipe it free of mud. Hiccup walked up to his desk to pack the last of his sketching supplies into his satchel, securing it to the thick belt around his waist. He needed to hurry before sunset, but he couldn't help but stop and admire the view from his window. He always preferred to stay in a second room at the top of the tallest tower in the castle. He had repurposed it from a watchtower into a small bedroom and workshop, although he'd have to clean out the piles of old drawings that were overflowing out the door soon. The trade-off for the cramped space was more than worth it, though. Stepping onto the windowsill, he leaned as far outside as he could into the sunlight. Up there, buildings of the city below him looked almost the same size as his wooden carvings lining his shelves. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath of fresh air, heavy with the scent of the sea. He heard his seagulls call above him and opened his eyes to the sky, the clouds, and drifting in the strong wind. The giant flags flying against the sunset-lit clouds made it seem as if the dragons were lighting them with their fiery breath. This was as close to the sky as he could get in all of Berk. Hopefully soon he would get even closer. Hiccup took off his crown, placing it inside a wooden box by the windowsill. Kneeling down under his drafting desk, he pushed against one of the smaller stones, opening a secret passage through the castle walls. Taking one last look out the window, he put on his helmet and entered the tunnel, closing the door behind him. Hiccup navigated through his usual routes in the tunnels. It was an intricate system, but he had the full thing memorized by now. Sometimes he would take advantage of them to go swipe a few meat pies from the kitchens. Other times he would eavesdrop on important meetings when his father barred him from attending. What he used them for most was sneaking out of the castle altogether. Unfortunately, it was too risky to go through the tunnels all the way to the outer walls, lest he get mistaken for an intruder and get shot on the spot. For today's exit strategy, he decided to sneak through the hallways around the war room, since they had just had a big meeting yesterday. That area of the castle should be relatively vacant. After checking if the hallway was empty of people, Hiccup pushed open the stone doorway and stepped out of the wall, gently closing it behind him. A few guards chose to round the corner then, and he ducked behind a suit of armor by the wall. After the guards had passed, he dashed out from behind the suit of armor and ran past the doorway.
They've overtaken the Berserk region.
Hiccup froze.
"Aye, Your Majesty,"
said the voice of Sir Finn Hofferson. Hiccup crept back towards the doorway, lifting the visor of his helmet to peek around the corner. The war room in the castle was where Berk's top knights and generals met with chief strategists during times of conflict. The ceilings were several feet high, and the walls lined with pillars, dividing up the giant maps of the land that hung in between. A circular skylight illuminated the center of the room, where a circular table lay with a map of Berk and the surrounding lands. Colored wooden figures marked off the areas that Berk still held, and the black figures where they had receded. The black had already moved another few inches closer since yesterday, several miles in scale. All the seats around the table and in the stands around the room were empty. The only people present were Sir Finn, Astrid's father, and
King Stoic,
Finn said.
It might be time to consider closing Berk's inner borders. Our forces are spread too thin across the forests, and the invaders only attack in the cover of night.
And leave the outer villages to fend for themselves? No, we still have time. If we can find their center of command, we can plan a counterattack.
But, my king, we can't pinpoint any points of communication in their formation. It's almost as if they're moving as one great wave.
It was never going to be an issue of communication. Stoic pounded a fist on the table and rubbed his eyes with his fingers.
It never is with you.
It may have to come to this, Stoic continued. We'll wait for more information from the scouts, then on my order we gather the knights and prepare for war.
Aye, my king, said Finn.
Your Majesty!
Hiccup jumped. A messenger was running down the hallway to the room. Hiccup managed to duck behind another suit of armor before she entered the room.
Your Majesty, said the messenger, you're needed in the throne room. The townsfolk are asking for an update so that they might prepare for the weeks ahead.
Stoic heaved a sigh, standing to his towering full height. His fur-lined cloak gleamed like a lion's skin in the sunlight, and the gemstones on his golden crown shone bright. The skylight cast deep shadows over his face. I'll be right over, Stoic said. The messenger bowed and left the room. Hiccup could hear Stoic's heavy footsteps getting closer to the doorway. He decided to risk it and dash out again before he was seen, only to bump into the king himself. Hiccup froze. His visor was still raised, but Stoic wasn't looking at his eyes. He wasn't looking at him at all. He was looking down the hallway to the next place he had to go to. Oh, sorry, son. Didn't see you there, Stoic said absently. There were deep shadows under his eyes. Hiccup nodded in response, watching his dad walk down the long hallway to the throne room. He stayed there for a long time after he was gone. Astrid had warned Hiccup not to get any grime or oil from the forge on the uniform. Luckily for her, there was no risk of that happening this time. However, he was going to accidentally fall into a puddle of mud and accidentally roll around in it for a few minutes. After all, he needed to hide the smell of fish from her too. He had been on his way to visit the cove yesterday, but had to visit the tanners outside of the city to pick up some leather for his current project. Then he had gotten distracted when he heard word of a performance of The Fall of Camelot and ended up catching the end of the third act. He ended up staying for the rest of the show. It was such a disaster that his morbid fascination kept him from looking away. Thankfully he stayed, too. Otherwise Jack would have ended up two-dimensional. Satisfied with his good deed for the day, he snuck away from the crowd, using Jack's closing speech as a distraction. However, the detour had cost him a good portion of the afternoon, and he had to run back to the city before Gobber closed down the forge for the day to drop off the pile of leather. Then he had to run home before his dad sent more guards after him. But that didn't stop him from getting thoroughly chewed out anyway. Then today, in between catching the new merchant shipment and another chance meeting with Jack, dodging the guards, and sparring session with Astrid and the squires, he barely just managed to squeeze enough time to come visit in the evening. He needed to be more on top of these visits, though. The news of the oncoming threat from the murderous mountains meant that he had about a month before the outsiders could make it to the city. The faster he finished this project, the faster he could prevent what very well might become an all-out war, one they couldn't win. After leaving the main city, he went off the roads into a small area of woods, pushing past the foliage until he came across the familiar hidden sanctuary. The sunlight from the golden hour was filtering through the canopy above them, making small spots of the pond at the center shimmer. The cove was oddly quiet, though. Hiccup set down the basket of fish that he had brought and crept down the stones, scanning his surroundings for any movement. He made it all the way to the bottom when he heard it. There was a rustling in the trees. He looked up. Waiting in the tree above him was a monstrous black creature. The trunk cracked as it adjusted the grip of its claws, and its tail swayed back and forth as it eyed its prey. The dark mass growled, splitting its lip over a sharp set of teeth. Before Hiccup could move, it lunged down from its perch, pushing him down to the ground. Hiccup landed on his back, the wind knocked out of him, struggling against the claws weighing on his chest. He heard the telltale shriek of air being rapidly inhaled and scrambled for his helmet. Right as the open mouth was over him, Hiccup yanked the helmet off his head.
Whoa, Toothless. Hey, it's me.
Toothless's eyes went wide, the thin slits of his pupils going so round that they almost overtook the bright green around them. He retracted his teeth, his tongue flopping out as he gave Hiccup a gummy smile. Hiccup grinned back, barely managing to close his mouth again before Toothless attacked him with a bunch of licks. He tried to push Toothless's head away, but the effort was half-hearted.
Okay, it's good to see you too, bud. He laughed. Now quit it. I'm only borrowing this uniform. You know that doesn't wash out.
After he got in a couple more licks, Toothless let him up. Hiccup only barely got back to his feet before Toothless bumped into him again, bouncing in a circle around him. He snatched up Hiccup's abandoned helmet off the ground, giving him another playful look before leaping further down the cove.
Hey!
Hiccup grinned, running to chase him.
Careful with that. It's on loan too.
Dusk was settling over Berk, and he knew he needed to head back home soon, but he couldn't help indulging himself in the game. It had only been an extra day away, but Hiccup had missed his best friend, and who he was allowed to be when he was with him. Judging by how often Toothless stopped to bump into him affectionately, the feeling was mutual. Their game ended when Hiccup caught Toothless around the neck in a very one-sided wrestling match. As his reward, Toothless sat up with Hiccup still hanging off of him. Hiccup fell onto the ground with a grunt, standing up just in time for Toothless to drop his helmet back on his head, now thoroughly covered in drool.
Ah, gross, Toothless.
Hiccup tossed the helmet aside, shaking the drool out of his hair. Toothless gave him a rumbling laugh, and Hiccup couldn't help joining in. He pushed his hair out of his face and looked up.
Good news, bud. I got the supplies, including extra bolts and screws. I can finish and test the next glider in 2 weeks.
Toothless grinned wide, a deep, happy rumble coming from his chest. He bumped his giant head into Hiccup. Hiccup laughed as he stumbled backwards, hugging him back once he regained his balance.
I know, right? I have a good feeling about this time, bud.
He took Toothless's head in his hands, closing his eyes and pressing their foreheads together. He smiled when Toothless crooned. He leaned away to meet Toothless's eyes, seeing himself reflected back in them. Hiccup gave him a determined smile, and Toothless returned it in his dragony way.
Once it works, we'll know how to fix that tail.